Hello everyone, this is Damon with Pixnub.com. For this video, I'm going to be going over the new smoke and fog brushes that you can get on our website. These are a set of very high resolution brushes that can create realistic looking smoke and fog in your images. Now to get started, you'll need to load in the brushes. So under your brushes window, select import brushes and then just hit load, which I've already done. So I'm not going to redo that. In CC, they'll be organized into 3 different folders. On CS5 and CS6, you won't have the folders because this folder structure was introduced a few versions back in CC. Now these brushes do require CS5 or higher to use, and that is because they are 5,000 pixels, most of them. And prior to that, the max brush size was 2,500. So to get started, you'll want to make a new layer because you typically don't want to paint directly on top of your image. And if you're painting white, which I'm going to be here at least for the first part of the video, but you can just use normal blend mode. If you're painting with color, depending on the color you're painting and the color of your background, you'll switch the blend mode. Typically screen or maybe linear light, sometimes soft light, and even multiply if you're painting a darker color. But for the case of painting white, normal and screen will look exactly the same, so I'll just paint with normal here. So there's 3 distinct types of brushes, and I'll be going over these one at a time. And the first is the base layers. You can't see the brush here because the brush is too large and it's past the edges of the window here. So if I move my image size down, I can see the brush. And you may have to scale the brush down too because 5,000 pixels is pretty large. If your image is a smaller resolution image, the default brush size will be many times larger than your screen and you won't see that. So just scale that down until you get the brush the right size. But you'll just stamp that into place. And you can see that there's many different varieties of these base fog layers here. And don't be afraid to scale these too to get the look that you want. I'll use this one to demonstrate here because I mean these are fog layers. You can scale these a lot and not have to worry about quality because there's not exactly sharp edges on the fog you have to worry about. So with this brush in particular, I like to use this one for ground fog. What I forgot to mention too earlier is I always use 100% opacity and flow on these base layers and then scale back the opacity in the layer as needed because you can always turn this back up later if you use it at full opacity and then turn it down in the layer. I might have scaled it a little bit much there, but you get the point, I guess, of the look I was going for. Alright, I don't know, somewhere in there. I'm not going to get picky for this. Just to show you, though, that you can use these brushes to get the exact look that you want without having to use them exactly as they come in for the scaling and size. I'm just going to undo this and find a brush that I actually want to use. Oh, before I do that, one more thing, too, I was going to mention. If your image is larger than 5,000 pixels and you can't have the brush fit the entire image, then what you can do too is at that point just scale it. Just make sure that the edges of your brush, I may have mentioned that earlier, I don't know, but just you can scale it to make sure the edges of your brush are then expanded past the edge of the image. And that is if like I say, your image is larger than 5,000 pixels, and the brush won't fit the whole image. All right, let's just move on. I think. Trying to find the one I thought looked well in this image. Okay, this one right here, 22. Just going to scale this to where I want it. Then scale my opacity back to around probably 80% or so for this. All right, it looks pretty good there. So the next thing I'm going to do is demonstrate the smoke and fog textures. Now, with the textures and the scatter brushes, these are the exact same texture. So texture 01 in the texture brush is the same texture as the texture 01 in the scatter brush. The difference is one you just paint on, and the other you stamp one at a time. So with the texture, you just stamp these on individually. And with the scatter, you just paint the brush on. But first I'm going to demonstrate the texture brush. Now with these, I like to use it doesn't matter if it's opacity or flow if you're just doing a single click. So I'll turn the flow down to 50. Now for the scatter brushes, where you're painting, the flow and opacity are completely different, and I'll demonstrate that in a little bit here when I get to those. But for this, I'm going to turn the flow down to 50, and that is so that I can overlap them without it becoming too white and washed out. So let's make a new layer. So anytime you paint the new brush with the different style, it's best to grab a new layer. I'm just going to hide that first one. And how I like to use these texture brushes is if I'm building a base layer of fog, these are really good for that. And then you can come into your brush tip shape here, and you can just angle this different for each stamp. That way you're not getting the same exact pattern. And then you can also, of course, come in and grab a whole new brush. But when you do, you see how white that is coming in. That's because it came in with a flow of 100%. Anytime you switch brushes, it's going to reset that flow, and you'll have to set it back to what you want. Now this is a little bit tedious painting this way, but this is how I paint these brushes, and you can paint on the top of the scene if you want. It's really up to you how you use these. I'm going to undo all of this and show you the easier way, although you have less control, but the easier way is to use the scatter brushes. Now the scatter brushes are really versatile for doing a lot of different things. You can use the brushes where you're using the full brush and painting on fog, or you can size it up and use just the edges of the brushes, similar to how we did last step, but then just paint on in the bottom of your image to give you a layer of a base fog layer here. And you can also click one at a time, and each time you click, you see it rotates, and the next time you click down, it's going to apply it near that position. And I say near that position because if you have the scatter turned on, which we do in these brushes, it won't be exactly there. You can turn your scatter off if you want to have a little more control. But this is a cool technique that I like to do is you can click off canvas and see your brush rotate each time until you get the brush in a position you want with the angle, and then come click in to add it. And then click again off canvas until you get a part of the brush you want to use somewhere, and then click that on the canvas. So pretty simple way to paint on your fog. And then you can use all these different brushes because there's many different styles. And I think this is a good brush to demonstrate this next thing. There's two things you want to mainly adjust with the scatter brushes. And that is your flow and your size. So with the flow, all of these brushes are saved with a reduced flow. And it varies. I think the lowest one is 12% and the highest one is 30 or 35. But 10 to 50 is the range that I will generally use these. And as a rule, the higher your flow, the more contrast in the opacity you will get. If I just demonstrate here, you see that we have areas that we can see all the way through and areas that are almost white right now. And it depends on the brush you're using too. This is a kind of a contrasty brush, the number 6 right here. But it's a good one to demonstrate this. And the lower your flow is, the more it'll paint on more transparent. But you have to go over this many more times to get the opacity built up. And then it starts filling in all those areas. And so it makes it a lot less variation in the transparency and a lot less textured at the same time. And the same thing, is true for all of the brushes. They all work the same, but they all have a different look to them. So you'll need to play around with the flow and then the size as well to get the look you want for each image, because you can get a dramatic different look. Let's go with a different brush here. For example, here's the brush at 500, which is probably too small for that, but at 5,000, completely different look to how this brush is painting on. I'm going to jump over to, I already had started this tutorial once, so I'm going to undo this. Had to redo the tutorial because of technical difficulties. All right, is this a good brush to use with it? Yeah, this will work fine, I think. All right, let me undo this. So if you're using brushes, you really need to understand the difference between flow and opacity. I'm going to demonstrate first with the opacity down to 20, or the flow down to 25% and the opacity up at 100. So I'm just holding the mouse down and just dragging back and forth. This is one mouse click and just holding it down to paint. You see that as I went back and forth, it started approaching the color of the brush. So each time you stamp, it's stamping at 25% opacity. But as you drag over, it's doing these additional stamps. And those are additive, so it's building up that opacity as it goes. Now that's different than if you were to turn the opacity down to 25% with the flow at 100. On this case, it's a maximum opacity of 25%. So whatever this white color is, 25% of that is going down. So if we click and just drag back and forth, once it hits that 25%, it does not add any more to that. So in the case of white, on the black here, we got a dark gray because that's 25% opacity, and that's the most we got. If we click and drag again, you see we're getting 25% more added to that the second time we click. And if I click a third time and drag, it's 25% more. So each time you click and drag the mouse, you are adding to it. But what happens is it becomes really washed out looking. And you see our first pass. Let me demonstrate that first one again. You see how quickly that becomes completely lack of texture because we hit that maximum opacity, which, just to demonstrate one more time, for the flow, it starts out with the lower opacity, but then as we go back and forth, it starts building up on that. So the flow is really the one you want to use when you reduce instead of the opacity, at least for this type of brush. So see how easy that is to build a nice base layer of fog there. So how I like to combine these is I will often use that base layer we got from these base layers and then build on that with the scatter brush. Let's just grab the first one here. I'm not really sure which one will look the best with this image, but you can play around with the different brushes and get the one you want to use for your images. And so really, it's that easy to build this entire scene of fog here. I probably spent 10 minutes worth of talking here, but I'm going to demonstrate this in real time, just how quick this was actually achieved. So new layer, base fog layer. Is it 23? No, it was 22. Yeah, this one. Control T to scale and move it into place. And then grab the scatter brush, make a new layer, and just fill in where we want the additional fog, and that's it. And then you can get a different effect with these different brushes, but still just as quick to apply the different brushes that have a different look to them. All right, the next thing I'm going to discuss is painting with color. Now, how I like to do color is a little bit different, but it's to actually use a solid color layer. And this way you can adjust the color when you're done, and you can also better see where you've painted too. And even on the prior technique where I was painting in layers, I did that in the video for simplicity. Usually I paint in the mask. And so whatever your solid color layer is, this is your paint color here. But you're actually going to paint white, but whatever the color layer is the color that it'll be. So then in the mask, Control I on Windows or Command I on Mac, we'll invert that mask. And so right now we're not seeing any of this color layer. But if we paint into the mask, let's just grab this first brush again here. Painting directly in the mask. Oh, I've got the wrong brush selected. I wanted the scatter brush. We'll get there. So the color is pretty light, so it's kind of hard to see here. But what we can do is, now you can go change the color at any time. Now see how flat this texture looks right here? That's because we're in normal blend mode. If you remember right, I said that when you're painting with color, it's usually best to use a different blend mode. So I'm going to set this mode to screen. So let's look at the difference here. Now, in particular, up where this light is behind it, where it was normal blend mode, you see that. What did I do? I'm trying to zoom in, and okay, there we go. I think I'm running out of RAM. This computer is getting very unresponsive. I'm recording 4K video, and it's probably eating up all the RAM right now. But anyway, you can see how this light here, we've put that darker color in front, and you can't even really see it. But if you're in screen blend mode, it will only lighten the image and not darken the image in any form. So you can see what that light comes right through, and the fog around that is lighter. So again, screen and normal. Screen is often a blend mode I will use. Another good one I like to use is linear light, but this is too strong. And with the linear light blend mode, You typically want to use your color very subtle. So I'm not sure if I'm getting the effect I want for this particular image with the linear light. It really depends on the colors in your images. But you can just see how a faint color has this dramatic effect on the color. And then if we're using this at a reduced opacity, it might give us the look we want. We see we've got white in the back where it's more transparent on the fog, and as the opacity starts building up, the color starts changing. Some of these blend modes are pretty, like you see vivid light there, they're pretty touchy. So you can get sometimes some really great looks, but you have to adjust your color just right. You see soft light for this. Soft light doesn't do much in this image. It really depends on the color of your fog and then the color of the background layer. But for this one, actually, I think screen looks the best. And then, as mentioned, you can come in and easily change the color. So if you want to give this a color that's completely opposite the image, you can come in here and just blend this however you want. And it's completely non-destructive because the color is not directly in the layer itself, or not on the fog itself. It's in the solid color layer. And if we Alt-click or Option-click on Mac, you can actually see where we've painted right in the mask. And then you can touch up and erase areas if you want, or do whatever kind of touch-ups you want with that. So overall, I think that about covers what I wanted to talk about here. So again, thanks for watching, and if you're interested at all in these smoke and fog brushes, please be sure to visit our website, that is pixnub.com.